Am 14. Juli fängt Foundation Staffel 2 endlich an. Die großartige Serie von Apple TV Plus geht weiter. Und vorab durfte ich nicht nur mit einigen der Darstellern sprechen, sondern tatsächlich auch mit dem Regisseur dahinter, David Goyer. Unser Interview hört ihr jetzt. Viel Spaß!
My name is Ricarda, and I'm from Germany, from Serien.tv. And my question would be, the story of Foundation kind of echoes the fall of the Roman Empire. And I was wondering if there are any themes in the show that also mirror the present political climate in the world.
Well, you're asking a leading question. Of course there are. Look, when Asimov was first writing Foundation, he was writing it in the shadow of World War II, but he was looking back to the decline and fall of the Roman Empire, as you cite. And his whole premise was that history and humanity are cyclical, and that if we're not careful, we can be doomed to repeat the mistakes of the past. Obviously, no one could have predicted in season 1 that we'd be facing a global pandemic, but of course, humanity has faced pandemics before. And as we moved into season 2, I don't think anyone was anticipating that Europe would be moving back into a kind of Cold War stance, but that seems to be where everyone is realigning once again. And some of our previous antagonists that were allies have shifted once again, but absolutely, I would argue that Foundation is perhaps even more relevant with season 2 than it was with season 1.
What you've done with 2 seasons of Foundation is remarkable. You have essentially rewritten Isaac Asimov, and I was wondering, what was the process like to do that?
Well, as you've alluded to, and in your question, particularly Foundation is big on ideas, but all the big action happens off screen. Right. Certainly early on in the early stories, the characters aren't, other than Harry Seldon, particularly well delineated. It's very much the stories and the early novellas are stories about ideas, and that's hard to adapt. So we had to bring conflict in. We had to bring in returning characters, and so each season, what we do is we say, okay, well, what are the central tenets that Asimov was writing about, and how can we adapt it to what's happening in today's world, and then how can we expand upon these characters and delve into their emotional lives? And so that's what led us to the idea of the genetic dynasty and the clones, which is something that doesn't exist in the books, but that's an extension of it. So we knew that we were not telling an anthological story, but an ongoing story. And we knew that we needed, the Empire exists in the background of Asimov's stories, largely as faceless characters, with few exceptions. But we knew that we needed some returning faces for our antagonists. And we knew that the story was going to expand from one century to the next. And so that led us to the idea of these clones, which allowed us to bring back the same actors season after season. Even though they're playing different characters, they're similar faces. And so they become the face of Empire, and it's a familiar face, and that's something that the audience can emotionally latch on to.
Asimov's stories have inspired so many generations of science fiction, and I was wondering what parts of it inspired you the most.
I was introduced to Asimov when I was 13 years old, and around the time I was introduced to Star Wars, in fact. But I remember being intrigued by the character of Harry Seldon, a character that could predict the future through math. I thought that was really cool. And I remember being introduced to characters like Bel Rios and the Mule, which were very memorable characters. The first time that I was introduced to Foundation, I didn't read it. I was told this story by my father. And so, and it was presented to me as the greatest science fiction work ever written and ever created. It was like the Bible of science fiction. And so over the years, the last sort of 20 years, I could see some of these antecedents appear in Star Wars and Star Trek and Dune and other things. And we had to figure out how to take something that had been around for 70 years and make it new again. And so to that extent, I said, when we're looking at the art and the production design, we need to make sure that we're not pulling references from Star Wars or pulling references from Star Trek, things that the mainstream audience would know of as science fiction. And so instead of looking to the future, a lot of times we look to the past. And, the watchwords that I would use a lot with our team was, let's go classic, let's go timeless in terms of our production design, in terms of our costume design.
You once said that you wanted to adapt the source material into 8 seasons of 10 episodes each. And I was wondering if you have some kind of knowledge about if Apple is going to sign you up on all of those seasons, or like, where are we headed after season 2? Can you confirm that the rest will be produced, or?
Of course, I can't confirm the rest will be produced. I mean, no, it depends on the reception for season 2, of course. I know that it is Apple's hope and intention to carry the story through all the way to, the end that I and the writers have come up with. I did, there is a document, a 4 or 5 page document where I laid out 8 seasons for Apple when we pitched 5 years ago. So there is a roadmap. We've adjusted the roadmap as we've gone on, but no one knows for sure what's going to happen. Hopefully we get there. Part of me thinks I was a little crazy to have pitched 8 seasons back then, because I've already been working on the show for 5 years. And so another 6 seasons would at least take me out, I don't know, another decade. So it's hard for me to think about that right now. I'm just trying to deal with it one season at a time.
I'm 100% here for another 6 seasons, so fingers crossed.
Okay, so we've got one. Right.
With the source material of Foundation being that old and actually being like the forefather to a lot of science fiction, for younger generations, it's sometimes hard to grasp that this came actually before Star Wars and other sci-fi sagas. So can you maybe elaborate a bit more on what effort you've put into making this show still look fresh and new and original?
Well, part of that is seeing if we can, for instance, the Prime Radiant, which is a important, gizmo in our show. I think it's described in Asimov's story as like a black cube. And I said, okay, well, we're going to reinvent that. And so it became, I think it's a kind of dodecahedron in our show. But I said, I want to recreate the way that we do holograms on our show. So we came up with these sort of particles that we described as sandigrams rather than holograms. And typically in a science fiction show, holograms emit light, but our sandigrams refract and reflect light and actually cast shadows. And so it's just re-examining every aspect of the show, how math is depicted, right? The math in our show is depicted in this kind of holographic visualization that does not use Roman numerals and is very beautiful. And I described to the design team as wanting the math to look like the language of angels. Well, what does that mean? I don't know. You guys figure it out. But I wanted it to be very different. I wanted the way that we travel through space, or, I described it as folding space rather than cutting through space. And so that led us to coming up with Empire ships that generate their own singularities, just things that we've never seen before. And so at every aspect, and sometimes we're more successful than others, I say, how can we do things a bit differently than perhaps have been depicted on screen before? How can we come at it sideways or from a new kind of angle? That led to the mural of souls and the act of chroma, and which is in and of itself very beautiful. And I've just never seen that before on screen. And frankly, a lot of the time we look to the past in terms of instead of the future for our points of reference. I often describe to my fellow practitioners on the show that I want Foundation to feel timeless and classic, And I want people to be able to watch it 20 years from now and still have a sense of, you know how when you see an old movie, sometimes there are movies that hold up and movies that don't hold up. I think the movies that hold up are the ones that feel timeless, that kind of, you know, work on an audience in a subconscious way so that it doesn't matter what generation is viewing it, it still feels like it's new again. And so that was really our approach to Foundation, is to come up with things that felt timeless and that hopefully won't feel dated 20 or 30 years from now.
You were previously involved in comic book adaptations like Man of Steel, for example. And I was just wondering, how does it differ to work on the adaptation of a science fiction novel now?
Well, the most obvious example when you're adapting a comic book is that there are visual references, right?
Yeah.
So for something like Foundation, we had some of the book covers, you know, over the intervening decades, but no one had ever done a movie of Foundation before, or a TV show, or a graphic novel. We'd never seen a depiction really of Harry Seldon other than, you know, one of the covers of the reissues, I think in the late 60s or early 70s. And so that's both a blessing and a curse. You know, I think when you're adapting a comic book, you're always going to have this pressure. Well, you know, how much does the live action costume of the superhero or supervillain, you know, cleave to what appeared in the comic books? And it's always difficult to take something from a two-dimensional medium to a three-dimensional medium. But we didn't have that burden with Foundation because there had been no adaptations of Foundation before. We were the first. I think the biggest thing we had to be wary of was the fact that, as different people have alluded to, Foundation, some of the ideas of Foundation had already influenced things like Dune and Star Wars. So we needed to be careful not to reference back to those, but to come up with new ways to depict all of these ideas.
Thank you so much for your time, Mr. Goyer. I'm really looking forward to season 2 of Foundation, starting on 14th of July on Apple TV+.